What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Marketing Millennials. Today, I have a really awesome guest. She runs marketing for a well known brand that probably most people have used in their life, Cetaphil. She'll give you a little background, but excited to chat. We're going to chat about culture relevancy and all things marketing today. So, welcome, Tara, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor. Following you and your channels make every day brighter for me.
I appreciate it. I want to get started about how did you get into marketing?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so I'm going to try to not be too long-winded, but from the time I was a little girl, I grew up in rural Central California. My dad's a third generation pistachio grower. And so I spent a lot of time with my mom shuttling me to dance classes as a little girl. And all there was to talk about were the billboards on the sides of the road in Central California across all the cotton fields and the almond trees. And so I, from a young age, became really passionate as a marketing critic. I would critique every single company and brand's ads that were on the side of the road. And if any of you have grown up in a small town, you spend a lot of time consuming media, whether it's commercials or it's magazines or whatever it is. I just became really passionate about looking at ads and knowing with my gut how amazing it would be if a brand could shift the look and feel or the message to be successful. So I remember telling my mom from a very young age that my dream job would be to work for brands and to help guide their marketing strategy.
That's really cool. I mean, not many people have that experience that they know from the beginning that they want to get into marketing. But it makes sense by being in a town where all you see is billboards everywhere and you pick up magazines and you're consuming media and you just have that time to diagnose all the good and bad marketing out there.
And
Um,
there's a lot of bad.
yeah. And I always say people recognize the bad more than the good. That's why marketing sometimes has a bad name out there because people see the bad and critique the bad. But there's a lot of great marketing that people don't see, and that's probably the point of it that they don't see it. But I want to get into the topic of today, and the topic I really want to talk to you about is what inspired your passion for keeping legacy brands culturally relevant.
Great question. So, I have a pretty diverse background. And when I graduated from college, I knew I wanted to go into beauty or fashion because that's naturally where my personal interests lie. And I ended up going to Fiji Water. And what was interesting about Fiji Water was that while it wasn't necessarily in fashion or beauty, it was a commodity. It's something that everyone needs. And so for me, I became fascinated with the idea of how do you make something so common so relevant, right? So perhaps I'm just addicted to the challenge of it. So while Fiji Water isn't exactly a legacy brand, it was water. Like, what's older than water? Right? And so, can you, as a marketer, I'm super passionate about this idea. Can you examine something that is so common and make it so cool and desirable and give it a bit of an edge over its competition? And so, I think that that's just something that I'm a little fascinated by. Um, and then being at Cetaphil now has been for me the ultimate challenge, I think. But I've always just been in love with marketing. And I am someone, maybe I have a love of nostalgia too. And so the idea of looking at these brands that I grew up with that maybe had fallen out of favor compared to the newest, hottest celebrity brand, for example. The idea that Gen Z in particular loves nostalgic brands as well felt like a great time to kind of bring that back for me.
Why do you think a lot of brands out there struggle with being culturally relevant?
I Great question, Daniel. I think it's because as someone who's been at brands that are small and big, I think by the time you work to build a brand that is considered iconic or legendary, you're a big brand. It's a machine. And as you get bigger, so does the risk, right? Whenever you touch any element of the brand, be it part of the brand image or the marketing model or even educational materials, it's considered a risk. And I think that older brands, what they did to get to where they are, they thought would keep going, right? And I think, you and I are both marketers, and I think the playbook for marketing success was kept the same for a long time, and maybe even for decades. I'm personally a big Mad Men fan, and I love to watch Mad Men and think about what it must have been like to be in marketing back in the day. And now I feel like what's working in marketing is changing week to week, month to month, right? So the playbook is changing, and I think heritage brands weren't quick to adapt necessarily because they're risk averse.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, a lot of people, you don't want to reinvent the wheel if the wheel's been working for a long time, but you also risk the wheel stopping if you don't reinvent it. So, one thing I wanted to get from you too is how do you approach like redefining a brand's relative while respecting the heritage of a brand?
Great question. So when I joined Cetaphil, I did a lot of investigating amongst my peer group that came from similar brands, and I also met with a lot of our regions. And one common theme that had become a bit of a saying was to strive to be as common as possible and only as different as necessary. And I felt like if that is the way, I think that says so much about the way heritage brands operate. So to move forward and to shift any of that, I think it starts with a blend of art and science. So as marketers, I think part of that is trusting our gut. And then I think part of that is matching it up with data, because especially when you're someone that's coming into a heritage brand, you don't want to be a bull in a china shop, right? You want to inspire with your ideas and the art side of it, but it has to be grounded in the science, which is the data. And so I came into Cetaphil with an open heart and an open mind, genuinely just a fan of Cetaphil. And I came in thinking, oh my goodness, if the brand is working as it is today with the image that it has and with the working marketing model, I won't touch it at all. But what I found through looking at data and through talking to the consumer, talking to the retailer, was that there was an opportunity to shift. And that was rooted in data ultimately.
What was the key data points that you looked at to see that hey, there is an opportunity here, or what should marketers be looking at to find those opportunities?
Great question. So there were three key points of data that I looked at. The first was consumer retention and acquisition. Okay. And what we were seeing was that our more mature consumers that were the ultimate brand loyalists, like they were continuing to be loyal, but we weren't recruiting at the younger generational levels. And so, due to the way life works, it's really important to make sure that you continue to recruit. And beyond that, we know that Gen Alpha is going to be the biggest population in the world's history within the next 10 years. So, it's a responsibility to look at that. So, it wasn't intentional, but we had a leaky bucket, as we would call it, with the consumer. We have to keep refilling the bucket on the consumer side. And then we looked at focus group data around consumer perception, asking groups of over 100 people broken into groups of 12 how they perceived our brand and how they perceived our competition's brand, and asking them this great question, which is, if all of these brands were at a party, how would you describe each of these brands? Is our brand the cool girl? Is our brand the wallflower? Is our brand the try too hard, etc.? And anything over I'd say 30 to 50 is something we consider statistically significant, and we had over 100 people that we spoke to, and they had this a common denominator, which was that they felt like Cetaphil had a really massive opportunity to become more known for something and to become a little bit less vanilla. And it wasn't offensive. The product was loved. Um, and so we were able to guide our strategy from there. The third element that we looked at was trust, consumer trust, and perceived efficacy. And so asking the consumer, hey, do you trust our brand? Do you trust us for results? And then asking by product category specifically, like, do you trust us more for cleanser? Do you trust us more for body cream or for serums, etc.? And then that collectively allowed us to get really, really surgical. So these three things I'm talking about now are not certainly not inclusive of all the KPIs we look at. But if you're considering looking at brand health, I think it's a good way to look at, one, where is your consumer demographic lying? Where are you losing consumers in the journey? And where are you acquiring consumers? And then nothing beats the focus group of sitting down and talking to as many customers as possible in a controlled environment, asking the same questions, and then asking the hard questions around consumer brand trust.
What I think you said really interesting, and I've had people on the podcast talk about this before, is the mature audience are normally like the brand loyalists, and that's just how their consumer behavior is. Um, but Gen Z, millennials, and then maybe I don't Gen Alpha's getting in there, but are very like discoverability, and even more Gen um, Gen Z's are more of like, I'll try anything. I'm just testing everything out. I don't care. I don't really have a loyalty. So how do you work with different generations? How do you make sure your marketing talks to the Gen Z, the millennials, while staying true to your brand loyalists?
Great question, and a loaded question at that.
Well, very
So,
loaded, but I had to ask because you're marketing to a lot of different people, so it's
for
interesting.
sure. So, controversial response might be, the truth, which is that I believe you can't be everything to everyone. I believe if everyone wants to buy you, that's amazing and that should be the goal, but I believe that you absolutely have to have a design target. And so, based on the opportunity that the brand had and the challenge that we had, we decided to do something a little bold, which was shift the design target to Gens Alpha, essentially. And that's based on the insight that typically, if we could do that successfully, without doing anything that was too bold and too jarring, right? Because we're self-aware enough to know that we are a mass skincare brand, right? We're not looking to shake the table too much, but ultimately, what we decided to do is to position the brand with that Gens Alpha design target, knowing with the hypothesis that it would still appeal to older generations who are looking for what is desirable, honestly, and that worked. So it's a multifaceted response. So as we were working with our creative agency Dingle on our rebrand, we stopped and did consumer testing along the way to ask not just our Gen Alpha target audience, but millennial plus too. Like, what do you think about this? Do you find this more appealing or less appealing? Do you find it more scientific or less scientific? And what we found was that although we were using Gen Alpha as a target audience, the older demographics found the rebrand the most appealing and the most scientific, even more than Gen Alpha themselves. So I think that hypothesis proved itself to be true, which is that although older generations might not um, be like brand agnostic like Gen Z is, they're more loyalists. They're also, I'm finding, to be more flexible and still wanting to be buying products that are viewed as desirable by younger generations.
Yeah, that's a very interesting insight. Also, I think thinking about it is, I mean, the a lot of the Gen Alpha parents are pretty much elder millennials, maybe even Gen X. So they are the parents of these people. So they are the ones usually probably buying for the Gen Alpha. So you kind of have to appeal to that audience while appealing to Gen Alpha. And it's cool that you blended both of those, and because they ultimately are going to make the ending buying decision for the Gen Alpha. The Gen Alpha might be the one pushing them along, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, we also know from consumer studies that Gen Alpha, what resonates with them so much is authenticity, right? Like I think we're so tired of hearing the word authenticity these days, but it's true. And so we intentionally made sure that our rebrand campaign was age inclusive and it was skin tone inclusive, and it was something that we wanted real people to see themselves in the campaign. Whereas before, our advertising, if I may be so bold, was a little bit more on the expected traditional side. And you might have seen one model and you didn't necessarily get a full vibe from the campaign, and you do now. To build on that thought, I also know that to be true because before coming to Cetaphil, I spent the nearly the past 10 years at LVMH's beauty brand incubator, Kendo Brands, where I worked with Marc Jacobs on Marc Jacobs Beauty, and in the later years of my time at Kendo, spent a lot of time on Fenty Beauty. And one of my most memorable campaigns at Marc Jacobs Beauty was signing Kaya Gerber, and we were her first beauty contract. I've been thinking about this a lot this week since she's on the cover of American Vogue and Mark is the guest editor. So was thinking about the fact that when we took that risk of signing Kaya Gerber on Marc Jacobs Beauty, she hadn't she didn't even have an Instagram yet. She was a relatively unknown model. But what was so incredible about that campaign is that it not only connected us to the younger generation, but for millennial plus, those of us that grew up with her mom, it just like hooked us at our heartstrings. And so we saw our consumer acquisition rates on Marc Jacobs Beauty go through the roof with that campaign, not just connecting the brand to Kaya's generation, but to older generations as well. So I came into point being to bring it full circle. I came into this role at Cetaphil feeling really confident about that about that idea that you shouldn't be afraid to reach young, because if you're smart about it, you can connect to the heartstrings of the older demographics too.
That's a, I mean, that's a really cool campaign. Having, I mean, obviously having her mom being so famous, and then you taking a risk on that, which I think it's a very good educated risk that she's going to be popular too because of her mom, but it's still a risk per se because nobody had used her as a model. So I think that's like what you said at the beginning, like using pretty much your data, but also using that art part of your marketing brain to make sure that this is how this campaign should go down.
Yeah, and I don't think we talk about it enough as marketers. And I feel like so many people are looking for a playbook on how to be successful in marketing. And at the end of the day, I feel like my biggest wins as a marketer have been fine-tuning that art, that instinct side, so that when you just know the second you hear a good idea, you just know that it's going to be successful, you know it's going to be viral, and you learn to trust that gut. And I think that that's a muscle that we can build and we can flex as our careers go on. But it's not something that you can learn by reading a book on marketing. That's for sure.
A lot of trends lately also have like a mixture of using obviously influencers, celebrities, but also using real people. So how do you balance those three categories of like the celebrities versus what influencers are big, and then also how to use like UGC from actual customers using the product?
Great question. I am very much a product marketing purist. So for me, as we talked about, younger generations are less brand loyalists. They tend to be more product loyalists. So for me, it starts with the product and the idea around the product. And the right person to front a campaign for a product could be a celebrity, it could be a real person, it could be 100 real people, or it could be an influencer. I think so. I'm open to using all of the above, honestly. That said, I do think you're right. We're at a moment where we're seeing a lot of different trends. And I do believe, as controversial as this may sound, that we're at a moment where celebrities have diminishing power over in the area of marketing. And I think for a celebrity to work, I think for the past few years, it had to just be very authentic. And now I don't even think that's enough. I think for a celebrity to work, the concept has to be right. You have to near break the internet with what we would call a chaotic marketing concept. Or I think at the end of the day, the celebrities that are commanding huge dollars, like for me, I would much rather, probably 90% of the time, sign a celebrity, excuse me, sign like an influencer that in place of a celebrity that has perhaps a smaller following, sure, like numbers to numbers, but someone that has this incredibly trusted affinity with their audience. And and then I think to support that campaign, real people using CGC, like consumer generated content, to make the product and the launch completely unavoidable. So I think you either have an influencer or you have a celebrity or a suite of any of that combination be in your official campaign, but you have to have real people as your advocates flooding the internet with consumer generated content. And I have a lot of conviction about this right now. And I've spent my career working with incredible A-list celebrities and emerging celebrities. I think that what can really, really work, and I'm a huge fan of what Skims did over the past like 12 to 18 months, where it seems like as soon as a celebrity begins to emerge as popular, on White Lotus, for example, a campaign drops. The fact that Skims has the foresight to know who's about to emerge and become culturally relevant at that moment, a campaign drops, is brilliant. They're able to work in real time because they have that foresight. On Cetaphil, we took a risk with signing Katie Fang, and we were getting ready to come out with our salicylic acid gentle exfoliating range. And and we had all these conversations. Do you sign a celebrity? Do you use a model? Do you use a product image? And at the end of the day, I thought, Katie Fang is the queen of the get ready with me amongst Gen Alphas. And she loves skincare. So why don't we why don't we go to Katie Fang and ask if she would want to front a Cetaphil campaign? And I had had personal experiences watching her convert to sales in my previous life and thought, if she's a Cetaphil fan, we should do this. And she had been using it since she was a baby, turns out, as had her whole family. And we were able to look at the KPIs following this campaign, Danielle. This is the first time that Cetaphil, a 77-year-old brand, had signed anyone like in a significant way, especially an influencer. And we put her at front of in-store activation, front of all of our streaming television, advertising, everything. And we looked at the KPIs. We looked at the Google trends. We looked at the Amazon sales. We looked at all of the engagement. And media had been turned on for this product before it went live, before Katie had been announced. And what we saw was, it wasn't until Katie Fang announced the collab with us and we had our that people started searching about for the product, and it wasn't until we had a pop-up event with her and this phenomenal dermatologist from Canada, Katie Belesne, that and it was in Soho in New York, and that was where sales spiked on Amazon, essentially. So as much as we want to play this game with media dollars, creativity and making bets on influencers as faces of campaign can be the biggest rewarding like initiative, I think.
I think that's a super cool story, and I want to also ask you, like, how do you stay culturally relevant, and how should marketers stay culturally relevant? Because I think you have to be consuming a lot of things to know that Katie was culturally relevant for Gen Alpha. Like, you had to be, because otherwise, and you had to have that instinct that, oh, watched her, seen multiple things that she's done to make the right guess. So how do you, as a marketer, stay culturally relevant?
Great question. I spend probably 10 minutes every hour scrolling TikTok. And before I go to bed, I spend at least 10 minutes scrolling YouTube. And I make sure that I'm on X twice a day. And that is part of my program. And I make sure that my team operates in the same way. And because I am a very old millennial, I I also love media and I'm always reading the news as well. So I not only know what's trending, but I know what's being perceived as relevant by the news media and by journalists, which is also something we have to take into account when we make these decisions. But I try to stay relevant through being very disciplined with checking social media. Honestly, I'm American, obviously, but I live in Switzerland, so my feeds are really unique because I get like the full stream of Euro trends as well as American trends. But I love it. I'm obsessed with it. We have to know what's happening out in the world. And that's genuine. I'm not doing it because I'm obsessed with being successful. I love human behavior and what makes products sell. That's what makes me tick.
I love that, because I always have the hypothesis that the best content creators, the best marketers are the deepest consumers, and I think you have to be a great consumer to be a great marketer. It works, but you can't just create things, because a new idea is basically two disjointed ideas put together, and you're just connecting the dots, and you need those dots by consuming. Otherwise, you're just never going to come up with anything really that creative.
Yeah. I'll give you an even more analog answer than that. So, 6 years ago, I moved from San Francisco to Paris. And my life changed when I moved to Paris and I started walking to work. Okay. And living in San Francisco, you know, the hometown of Uber, I wasn't doing a lot of work walking in San Francisco. And when I moved to Paris, I found myself walking to work, which was about 30 minutes every day. And because Paris is so beautiful, like you want to enjoy that, right? But I found myself walking and looking at people, looking at businesses, looking at architecture, walking through the park, naturally looking at street style, looking at beauty trends, looking at advertisements that were going by on buses, looking at what was in the metro. And I had never been more grounded, like in nature or what was happening around me. I wasn't just rushing to hop on in an Uber or rushing to the airport. And so I got the best ideas by living that lifestyle, honestly, because I was able to pick up on real relevant consumer behavior in a way that I hadn't been before. Because I think a lot of us are very much at risk of losing our edge, our creative edge, because we're rushing to the office, we're coming up with ideas on demand, and we're not spending enough time out in stores and on the street seeing real consumer behavior. When I was in San Francisco last month, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in stores, and I spent hours just talking to our consumers. Literally standing in Walmart in my Cetaphil sweatshirt asking consumers what brought them in, what made them want Cetaphil. And that was incredibly eye opening for me. And I recommend that every marketer do that.
Yeah, I think another part of it is there's so much you can only get on social media because it is tailored, it is to your interests. There's so much different things you can get from just walking in a culturally relevant city like Paris or New York, or where you can actually feel what consumers are doing and see what consumers are doing. And also looking at going to different cities and looking like what billboards are they showing in this city versus this city, like what stores are people going to, and what are the different stores in this city versus. You can learn so much about a city by looking at the billboards, looking at the stores that pop up, looking at, because you could tell, like for Paris, obviously, it's fashion everywhere. Everything's fashion. You can tell it's a fashion city. If you go to Austin, Texas, it's all health brands, and you know it's a health city. You could tell a lot about a city by what stores and what advertising they're doing there. So
Yeah, absolutely. I remember walking to my office and back, and at the time, I had just moved to Paris. Okay. Like I was hungry to understand who was relevant and what was happening culturally in Paris at that time. And I saw this incredibly beautiful woman who was in this campaign for La Paradis Latin, which is the Moulin Rouge's competitor. And her name was Iris Mittenaire. Iris Mittenaire was a former Miss Universe that had been Miss France. So France was incredibly proud that Miss France had made it to Miss Universe. And she was so cool and so beautiful that La Paradis Latin had signed her on as a guest performer. And I saw her everywhere. I saw she had nearly 2 million followers. And because of that, I asked my team about her. And because of that, I thought, we were launching a new mascara campaign. We should ask Iris Mittenaire. And so we asked her to be the face of a mascara product for KBD Beauty. And it was hugely successful. But if I had, not been out walking around and seeing what was alive around me in my city, I might not have ever have learned about Iris Mittenaire, candidly. So I'm really passionate about that.
and what is a marketing hill you would die on?
Ooh, marketing hill I would die on. That mm, that execution is everything. Honestly, I think that just because your brand is priced a certain way doesn't mean that you should not put your best foot forward. So I believe we should always do our best in terms of how we show up. I think about McDonald's a lot, and the experience is the same no matter where you go around the world. They might have a localized menu, but McDonald's is McDonald's, and I think we should strive for. I think we should strive for complete global consistency through excellence of execution.
I love it. I always say like consistency is the number one trust builder in the world. If you can stay consistent and people you show up consistently wherever you are, even with creating content or doing whatever you do in like at work as a brand, you are seen way more trustworthy if you are that consistent person or brand that just keeps doing that, showing up that way. And obviously, the last question I have for you is where can people find you and what you're doing?
Ooh, great question. So I would recommend from a brand standpoint, Cetaphil. You can follow Cetaphil on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. And myself personally, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn and on X and Instagram.
As we heard early in the conversation, you have your 10 minutes a day of TikTok, you have your X time, and you have your YouTube time. But there's other we didn't talk about the LinkedIn time, which is not really for your brand, but for yourself. But so you're always on social. That's good to know. Well, thank you so much for joining, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel. It was an honor to be on your podcast. I'm a huge fan of what you do, like I said before, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.